They had just moved to a quiet residential area and went out for a morning jog after a devastating hurricane. But under the upturned roots of a fallen tree, the newlyweds stumbled upon something that turned the lives of the entire neighborhood upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered in the quiet streets. Dawn crept slowly over the suburban neighborhood, the light pale and uncertain, as if even the sun hesitated to return after such a night. Rows of single-family houses lined the streets with their trim lawns and white fences, some fences now broken and leaning, their neatness spoiled by the violence of the wind. Shingles lay scattered on sidewalks like playing cards, branches blocked driveways, and in some yards, whole trees had fallen, their roots ripped from the earth as if a giant hand had tried to pry secrets from beneath the soil. The air was heavy with the smell of wet bark and upturned dirt. Somewhere far off, a generator droned steadily, its mechanical hum breaking the otherwise eerie stillness. It was a morning that carried both relief and unease. The storm was gone, but it had left scars. Marcus tied the laces of his running shoes on the front porch, while the damp boards creaked beneath his weight. The house they had bought just months ago stood solid and unshaken, though the gutters were clogged with leaves and the flower beds were filled with debris. He took a deep breath of the cool, humid air and let it out slowly. Beside him, Leah stretched her arms toward the sky, the soft cotton of her sweatshirt dampened slightly by the mist still hanging over the lawns. She glanced at him with a small, tentative smile. Neither of them had slept well. The wind had roared for hours, rattling the windows and groaning through the trees until long after midnight. But the house had held. They were safe, and the morning, for all its strangeness, was a gift. Running had become their way of claiming this place, of stitching themselves into the fabric of the neighborhood. They were newcomers, two young black professionals who had saved and worked for years to escape the cramped apartment blocks of the city. Here, the streets were wide, quiet, and safe. The neighbors smiled politely, though still from a distance, and the couple had believed time would make them belong. After the storm, they felt an odd urgency to reclaim normalcy. The night had been frightening, a reminder that life here wasn't as invulnerable as it seemed, but to run was to say they were still here, still moving forward. They set off at an easy pace, their breath steaming in the cool, damp air. The neighborhood was subdued. Curtains twitched as a few early risers peered out to check the damage. A man in a robe dragged a trash bin back upright. Somewhere, a child cried briefly and was hushed. The street smelled of wet pavement and splintered pine. Marcus kept his stride steady, scanning the houses they passed. Some had lost shingles. One had a fence crushed beneath a fallen limb. Leah ran slightly ahead, her ponytail swinging with each step, eyes alert to the unfamiliar scene of disruption in what had seemed a perfect enclave just yesterday. As they turned onto a side street, lined with older houses, shaded by massive oaks and maples, they slowed instinctively. Here, the damage was worse. Debris was piled high at the edges of the road, and power lines drooped dangerously low, though still intact. Then Marcus saw it, a tree larger than any he had ever noticed before, now sprawled across a front yard and half onto the sidewalk. It had been a giant, easily a century old, with a trunk thick enough that 3 men might not have encircled it. The storm had torn it from the ground and laid it on its side, roots jutting skyward in a tangled mass of wood and soil. The sight was almost majestic in its destruction, like some ancient creature slain in the night. Leah slowed to a stop, placing her hands on her knees for a moment as she caught her breath, but her eyes were fixed on the exposed roots. The earth there was raw and dark, heavy clods clinging to the twisted network of what had once anchored the tree deep underground. Amidst that darkness, something pale caught the weak morning light. At first it seemed like a stone, smooth and curved. She frowned, tilting her head. Something about it was wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate a shape. She pointed silently toward it, and Marcus followed her gaze. He stepped cautiously off the sidewalk onto the soggy grass, the mud sucking faintly at his shoes. The smell of wet earth grew stronger as he neared the fallen giant. Kneeling, he brushed at the surface with tentative fingers, dislodging clumps of dirt. What emerged sent a chill racing up his spine. The curve was not stone at all, but bone, unmistakable in its smoothness. A portion of a skull, pale, weathered, the edge of an eye socket faintly visible beneath the clinging soil. For an instant, Marcus froze. His breath caught mid-chest. He had never seen human remains before, yet some ancient recognition struck him deep and certain. He jerked his hand back as though from a flame. Leah, watching from a few feet away, straightened slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to dread. The quiet of the street seemed suddenly louder, the distant hum of a generator, now a hollow roar in her ears. The fallen tree no longer looked like a simple casualty of the storm, but like a wound torn open to reveal something the earth had meant to keep hidden. Marcus glanced back at her, his face pale. Neither spoke. Words felt both inadequate and dangerous. He wiped his hand on his damp shorts, then reached for his phone with clumsy fingers. His heart hammered against his ribs. Part of him wanted to back away, to pretend they had seen nothing. But another part, stronger, steadier, insisted they could not walk away from what was clearly a human being. Someone had been buried here, beneath this quiet street, under the roots of a tree that had shaded birthday parties and weekend barbecues for who knew how long. The storm had not only toppled a landmark, it had unearthed a story. Leah moved closer, keeping a cautious distance from the exposed bone. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the damp morning felt, despite the lingering southern humidity. The neat row of houses seemed to recede, becoming unreal. For months, she and Marcus had tried to believe this place was safe, untouched, a perfect retreat from the city. Now the ground itself whispered otherwise. Marcus lifted the phone to his ear after dialing emergency services. His voice was low, tight as he described what they had found. A fallen tree, human remains in the exposed roots. The dispatcher asked calm, efficient questions. Location, safety, whether they could stay clear of the site. When he ended the call, silence settled between them again, broken only by the drip of water from the massive, upturned roots. They stood waiting, uncertain of what to do next. A breeze stirred the shredded branches, carrying the smell of fresh earth across the yard. Somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, a door opened and shut. A man in slippers stepped out with a cup of coffee, glanced their way, then paused as he noticed the fallen tree and the strangers standing motionless before it. He frowned, but Marcus offered no explanation, unable to find words. Minutes dragged. Leah's gaze kept drifting back to the pale curve in the mud. She tried to imagine who it might have been. A worker from long ago, a forgotten grave, something darker. But her imagination faltered against the simple, raw fact of death. Whoever this was had been placed here, or left here, long before the houses, the fences, the trimmed hedges. The thought unsettled her more than the storm had. The first distant wail of a siren reached them, thin and rising. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief mingled with dread. Help was coming. But so was attention, questions, intrusion. He and Leah exchanged a glance, a silent confirmation that what they had stumbled into was now bigger than them. Their quiet morning run had become a doorway into something ancient and unresolved. As the siren grew louder, the street seemed to wake. Curtains moved. A garage door opened somewhere down the block. Life in the neighborhood, lulled by the storm's departure, was stirring again, and would soon know what had been found. Marcus felt a strange weight settle over him, a mixture of responsibility and fear. Leah touched his arm briefly, grounding them both in the simple reality of the moment. They had seen the past emerge from the earth, and nothing would be the same. When the patrol car finally turned the corner, lights flashing softly in the mist, the couple stepped back from the exposed roots. The officer inside slowed as he took in the scene, the giant fallen tree, the two runners standing still, the eerie glimpse of bone among the dark soil. The morning that had begun with a search for normalcy was ending in quiet revelation. The storm had taken away branches and fences, but it had also torn open a secret the neighborhood had been built upon. Marcus and Leah, breathless and damp from more than running, understood without speaking. This was only the beginning. The sound of the approaching sirens faded into the thick morning air as the first patrol car came to a stop in front of the fallen giant. Its slow crawl up the street drew curious faces to windows and porches, people craning to see what emergency could warrant flashing lights in their otherwise uneventful cul-de-sac. Marcus and Leah stepped back instinctively, retreating toward the curb as the officer emerged. He was a middle-aged man with a damp cap pulled low, his boots squelching slightly on the soaked lawn. His gaze moved quickly from the toppled tree to the exposed bone, then to the young couple who stood pale and silent. Questions came quickly and professionally. Marcus found himself describing how they had been out for their morning run, how Leah had noticed the pale curve, how he had brushed the soil away and seen what could only be a human skull. His voice felt distant to him, as though someone else were speaking. Leah added small details where he faltered, her tone steady but her eyes still wide with the shock of discovery. The officer listened without interruption, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly when he glanced again at the hollow under the roots. He radioed for backup and forensics, his clipped words carrying through the damp air. Within minutes, the quiet street was no longer quiet. Another patrol car arrived, followed by an SUV marked with county forensics. Yellow tape was stretched hastily around the perimeter of the yard, fluttering weakly in the humid breeze. More officers stepped out, their dark boots leaving prints in the wet grass as they surveyed the scene. A few neighbors had ventured closer, standing just beyond the tape with crossed arms and wary eyes. Some still held mugs of coffee. One man wore pajama pants and slippers, his curiosity outweighing propriety. The storm had left the neighborhood shaken but intact, and now, before anyone could even finish sweeping their driveways, something far older than the wind had reached up from the soil. Marcus and Leah moved aside when asked, standing together near the curb. They felt exposed under the watchful gaze of strangers and neighbors alike. The officer who had first arrived offered them curt thanks and advised them to remain available for further questions. Neither of them knew whether to leave or stay. It felt wrong to walk away when they had been the ones to uncover whatever secret had slept here, but it also felt intrusive to linger as professionals in gloves and heavy boots stepped in to claim the scene. The first forensics team worked methodically. They took photographs of the massive roots, of the exposed skull, of the surrounding yard littered with storm debris. Cameras clicked softly, while one technician knelt and brushed away soil with careful strokes, revealing more of the pale surface. The skull's curve emerged more clearly, the hollow suggestion of an eye socket filling with rainwater. A murmur passed between two of the team, and soon more digging began. Bits of rib bone appeared, a jaw, the delicate bones of a hand curled unnaturally close to the surface. A rust-colored fragment of metal clung to one wrist. The air changed when that appeared. Even the most stoic officers grew quieter. The sight of the shackleth that was indeed what it was sent a low ripple through those watching. One of the forensic leads stepped back and called over a supervisor. Soon after, a senior detective arrived, a man with lined features and a rain-spotted trench coat. He moved with the calm of experience, but his eyes sharpened when they landed on the metal cuff. He crouched near the exposed bones, speaking in a low voice to the technicians. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he saw their faces harden. Neighbors whispered behind the tape. At first, the speculation was timid. Maybe it was an old cemetery. Maybe some forgotten grave marker had washed away long ago. But when someone caught sight of the shackle, the tone shifted. There was an audible gasp from one woman. A man muttered something and shook his head. A pair of teenagers, phones already raised, backed away uneasily. Leia shivered, drawing her sweatshirt closer around her shoulders. The history of the region hung suddenly heavy in the humid air. This was the South, after all, where the ground held more than tree roots. The thought was unspoken, but palpable. Slavery. Violence. Buried stories no one wanted to face. More vehicles arrived as the morning deepened. A van without markings, but with a mounted light tower parked at the curb, technicians unloading equipment for a proper excavation. The detective conferred with them briefly, then turned to speak with Marcus and Leah. His voice was calm, courteous, but edged with the gravity of what they had found. He thanked them for staying and asked a few more questions. How long they had lived in the neighborhood, whether they had seen anything unusual before the storm. Marcus answered quietly, conscious of the cluster of neighbors listening from a few yards away. Leah added that they had never noticed the tree being anything more than a landmark on their runs. The detective nodded, offered a tight smile, and suggested they head home for now, but remain reachable. He promised someone would follow up. They walked back toward their house slowly, silent for several blocks. Behind them, the scene grew busier. The yellow tape now enclosed almost the entire front yard where the tree had fallen. Floodlights were being raised despite the morning sun breaking through clouds. Officers guided curious onlookers farther back. The once tranquil street had become a stage for something grim and deeply rooted. At home, Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, shoes still muddy, staring at nothing, while Leah rinsed her hands at the kitchen sink, as though she could wash off the morning. Neither spoke for a long time. The sound of the generator across the street hummed through the quiet house, and every now and then, a car slowed outside, drivers rubbernecking toward the commotion down the block. It felt surreal. They had come out to reclaim normalcy, and instead found themselves at the heart of a discovery that would alter the calm image of this neighborhood. By midday, the news had already started to spread. Phones buzzed with group texts from neighbors. Questions, rumors, speculation. Someone posted a blurry photo of the fallen tree and police tape to a local social media group. Comments multiplied within minutes. Human remains found, one wrote. Could be some Civil War thing. Another claimed they had heard it was a crime scene. Soon the word slave appeared in a thread, followed by a heated debate. Some insisted the land had once been part of an old plantation. Others dismissed it as gossip. Leia scrolled briefly, her stomach turning, then set her phone face down. Outside, small knots of residents gathered at street corners, voices low but intense. Marcus watched from the living room window as a man pointed toward the taped yard while talking to two women, their faces grave. The easy friendliness of the suburb had shifted into something taut and uncertain. A place that prided itself on safety and new beginnings now found its soil telling another story. In the afternoon, a black SUV pulled up to their driveway. An officer stepped out, polite but direct, asking if they could answer a few follow-up questions. Marcus and Leah invited him in, still dazed but cooperative. He asked about the moment of discovery again, their perspective on the neighborhood before this. He reassured them they had done the right thing by calling, that uncovering the past, no matter how uncomfortable, was important. His calm professionalism was comforting, yet it couldn't lighten the unease that had settled in the house. As evening approached, the sound of activity down the street continued. Trucks came and went. Floodlights glowed brighter as daylight faded. The massive tree remained sprawled like a fallen sentinel, but now its roots were ringed by people in gloves and masks, carefully lifting away centuries of soil. Marcus imagined the hollow widening, history being peeled back inch by inch. He felt both relieved and disturbed to have left it to the experts. The image of the skull, of that rusted metal around the wrist, replayed in his mind every time he closed his eyes. Dinner was quiet. Neither of them had appetite. They sat across from each other at the table, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of neighbors filtering through the walls. When darkness fell, the floodlights outside cast a faint glow even into their yard, as if the night itself wanted to watch. Leah finally whispered that she couldn't shake the thought of how easily they might have run past, and never looked down. Marcus nodded slowly. The randomness of it unsettled him. They hadn't chosen this knowledge, but now they carried it. By nightfall, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted fully. Cars slowed as they passed the taped lawn. Groups of teenagers gathered briefly before being chased off by officers. Social media buzzed with unconfirmed claims: an unmarked graveyard, an enslaved person, a murder victim. Some posts begged people not to sensationalize, others speculated wildly. Fear mingled with fascination. The storm had peeled back more than a tree. It had peeled back the illusion that this quiet place was untouched by the darker chapters of history. Before bed, Marcus stepped outside for a moment, needing air. The street was quiet now, the crews gone, the tape fluttering softly. The tree loomed like a shadowed carcass in the yard, where the lights had burned all day. He felt the night press in, humid and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth, and something older, harder to name. He thought about the man who had lain there unknown, the silent witness beneath generations of roots and footsteps. Whoever he was, his secret was no longer safe. When Marcus returned inside, Leah was sitting on the couch scrolling through local news. An article had already appeared online. Storm uncovers human remains in Oakwood Heights. The photo showed the tree's sprawling roots under a gray sky, police tape cutting across the frame. The article mentioned possible historical significance, quoted officials saying it was too soon to draw conclusions. But the comment section told another story: rumor and speculation, anger and denial. Marcus closed the laptop gently. They went to bed without many words. Sleep came fitfully, chased away by the image of pale bone and rusted metal. Outside, the fallen tree waited in the dark, roots lifted like broken arms, the wound of earth wide and raw. Whatever had been hidden, there had begun to speak, and Marcus and Leah, however unwillingly, had become its first witnesses. The next day would bring more officials, more questions, and the slow unearthing of a history the neighborhood had built itself upon without ever acknowledging. The storm's damage could be repaired, fences mended, shingles replaced. But the secret it had dragged into the light could not be buried again so easily. The following morning dawned without the comfort that usually comes after a storm. The sky was washed a pale, uncertain blue, and the air, though calmer, still clung with a damp heaviness that seemed to press against the neighborhood's silence. Marcus and Leah woke early, but lingered in bed, listening to the muted sounds outside. The occasional creak of someone dragging debris to the curb, the distant whir of a chainsaw cutting through fallen limbs, the hum of trucks returning to continue repairs. Yet even those normal post-storm sounds were undercut by something new, an intangible hush, a tension in the air that felt like a held breath. The night before had changed the street. They both felt it. Marcus sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing his palms slowly over his face, as though trying to wipe away not just sleep, but the weight of the previous day. Leah watched him, silent for a long time, then rose to open the curtains. The sight of the fallen tree still sprawled across the yard down the street struck her like a fresh wound. Floodlights and equipment were gone, but the yellow tape remained, flapping weakly in the morning breeze. The roots jutted skyward in a grotesque display, the raw pit of soil beneath them now dark and empty, where the skull had once stared up. It looked almost peaceful from this distance, but they both knew it was not. Something had been taken from the ground, and its absence felt louder than its presence had. They ate breakfast mechanically, cereal and toast without taste, neither speaking much. Both checked their phones. Overnight, the online chatter had multiplied. The local news outlets had published updates, including cautious statements from authorities. Historical human remains. Preliminary assessment suggests over a century old. Further investigation underway. But the comments beneath the articles told a more restless story. Some were fascinated, treating the discovery like a local mystery to gossip over. Others were defensive, angry that the neighborhood might be stained by an ugly past. A few voices, quieter but persistent, insisted this was an opportunity to face history honestly. Reading them left Leah unsettled. She put her phone aside, feeling the invisible web of opinions tightening around something that had started as a single, fragile moment between her and Marcus on a damp lawn. Late that morning, new vehicles began to arrive at the taped yard. Black sedans, a white van with a university emblem, a county coroner's SUV. Marcus and Leah stepped out onto their porch to watch. The activity was quieter than the day before, but somehow more purposeful. Men and women in plain clothes, some carrying clipboards, others cases of delicate tools, moved with the focused calm of experts. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged man in a pressed shirt despite the humidity, walked over to greet them, asking politely, but with strained cheer, whether the remains were just old history or something criminal. He received no answer beyond a courteous smile. Soon, more neighbors gathered in small clusters, their whispers traveling easily in the still air. The owners of the house where the tree had fallen emerged late in the morning. Marcus and Leah hadn't met them before. They were a couple a little older, with two children who peeked anxiously from the doorway before being ushered back inside. The father stood stiffly near the porch, arms crossed, as officials spoke to him. From where Marcus and Leah watched, his face was pale with confusion and quiet dread. He had likely bought this house believing, as they had, in its safety and respectability, the dream of a quiet suburban refuge. Now his yard was a dig site, his land a headline. Leah's heart tugged with sympathy. She knew what it meant to feel that your sanctuary had been pierced. By midday, the speculation in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. At the far corner of the block, a group of longtime residents had gathered, voices rising and falling as they pieced together half-remembered stories. One elderly woman spoke with conviction about hearing her grandmother warn children not to play near that old oak because the ground was unsettled. A man countered, claiming the area had been farmland, and nothing more sinister than a hired hand buried after a fever. Others muttered darker theories: a runaway slave caught and killed, an overseer murdered by the people he abused. Each telling shifted the story, as if the truth were clay being reshaped in every mouth. Marcus stood with Leah a little apart, listening without joining. Each rumor felt like a grasping hand, trying to claim something that was not yet theirs to hold. That evening, a community meeting was hastily arranged at the local church. It was not official, just neighbors trying to process what had happened. Marcus and Leah debated whether to go, but ultimately decided they should. Inside the fellowship hall, folding chairs had been set up in rows, and the smell of coffee and damp coats filled the air. Faces were drawn tight with curiosity and unease. A retired teacher stood at the front, unofficially guiding the conversation. She began by acknowledging the shock everyone felt, and then invited people to share memories or knowledge about the history of the land. What followed was a jumble: family anecdotes, half-believed legends, vague references to property once belonging to a wealthy 19th-century landowner. Each voice seemed to search for certainty, but found only fragments. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, reluctantly prompted by a neighbor who noted they had been the ones to find the remains, he chose his words carefully. He described the morning as it had been: the run, the fallen tree, the strange pale curve in the mud. He avoided speculation, resisting the pull to assign meaning to what they had seen. Leah sat beside him, quiet but supportive, her presence a steady anchor. They wanted to honor the gravity of the moment, not feed gossip. Yet as they spoke, Marcus could feel eyes on them, some grateful, some guarded, and a few distinctly cold, as if accusing them of bringing trouble to a peaceful street. After the meeting, whispers followed them out the door. One man muttered about property values dropping. A woman sighed that everything these days turns into race and guilt. Another touched Leah's arm briefly, thanking her for caring about the truth. The walk back home under the humid night felt long. Streetlights cast pale circles on the wet pavement, and every glance from a porch or window felt loaded. They had not asked to be part of this, but now the neighborhood knew them as the ones who had woken the past. In the days that followed, the weight of the discovery only grew heavier. The excavation became more precise. Archaeologists arrived with screens to sift soil, carefully recovering even small fragments of bone and rusted metal. The press returned for more photographs. News crews parked vans at the edge of the street. Reporters tried to speak to residents, some eager to give quotes, others slamming doors. Marcus and Leah avoided the cameras, slipping out only for short walks. They felt exposed enough already. Yet despite their caution, the story found its way to them. An elderly neighbor named Mrs. Albright stopped by one afternoon with a tin of cornbread as an excuse. She sat at their kitchen table and told them, in a voice heavy with old memory, about how her father used to say the land carried secrets from before the war. He had warned her never to dig too deep near certain trees, saying some things were best left buried. Her words sent a shiver through Leah. It was not proof, but it was history whispered through generations, a silent understanding that something violent had happened here and been covered over by time and convenience. For Marcus, the personal weight of it began to settle in unexpected ways. He thought of his own ancestors, the ones he knew and the countless he did not, their names lost to history, their lives reduced to traces in census ledgers and fading family stories. The sight of the shackle haunted him, cold iron eating into bone, the final indignity of bondage. It wasn't only history in an abstract sense. It was the story of people who looked like him, whose suffering had been hidden under the manicured lawns of places like this. Every time he jogged past a row of perfect hedges now, he wondered what might lie beneath. Leah felt it differently, but no less deeply. For her, it was the fear of silence, the way communities preferred comfort over truth. She watched neighbors turn defensive, insisting the past should stay buried because it was so long ago and doesn't matter now. She saw how easily shame turned to anger. At night, she lay awake beside Marcus, thinking about the man under the tree, how easily he might have been forgotten forever, if not for a random storm and two runners who happened to look down. That thought scared her as much as the violence itself. One evening, Restless and unable to bear the quiet weight of the house, Marcus suggested they walk. They followed the familiar loop past the taped yard, now quieter, but still marked by its yellow boundary. The house itself was dark, except for a single porch light. The owners had drawn their blinds, retreating from the constant attention. Marcus and Leia stood on the sidewalk, neither speaking for a while. The ground looked ordinary, but they could feel its wound. Marcus thought about how easily it could heal over again, buried under grass and landscaping until no one remembered. The idea felt wrong. They continued down the street and stopped when they saw an older man leaning against a mailbox, watching the sunset fade into the bruised remnants of storm clouds. He introduced himself simply as Clarence, one of the neighborhood's longest residents. Something about his steady, weathered presence invited trust. Marcus hesitated, then asked, almost without planning, if Clarence had ever heard stories about the land. The old man was quiet for a long time before answering. He spoke slowly, each word careful, of a night long ago when a wagon had passed through without lanterns, moving silently down what had once been a dirt road. His father had told him of screams carried on the wind, of neighbors who turned their backs and pretended not to hear. No one ever asked questions. No one wanted to know. Clarence didn't claim certainty, but the story had lingered, a shadow tied to the very spot where the tree now lay. Marcus felt the words sink into him like stones. The simple, unembellished recollection rang truer than the gossip of the street. Leia felt her chest tighten. Here was not rumor, but memory, passed quietly from father to son, heavy with the weight of complicity. They thanked Clarence softly and walked home under a darkening sky. Neither spoke, but both felt the air change. The discovery was no longer abstract. It had roots in the choices of ordinary people who had once lived here, people who had known and stayed silent. That night, sleep would not come. Marcus sat by the living room window long after Leia had gone to bed, staring down the street at the dim outline of the fallen tree. The yellow tape fluttered faintly in the night breeze, and beyond it, the hollow of earth yawned like an open question. He felt history pressing against the glass, insistent and unyielding. He could almost imagine the land itself whispering, demanding to be acknowledged. This wasn't just an old story or a curiosity for archaeologists. It was a wound passed from one generation to the next, and now, by chance or fate, it had been placed at his feet. He realized then that silence was not neutral. The neighbors who wanted to move on were repeating the very thing that had kept the man under the tree nameless for so long. The community meetings' polite evasions, the online dismissals, they were the same as the wagon passing in the night and the people turning away. Marcus felt anger rise slowly, mingled with sorrow. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, but he couldn't ignore it. When Leah came down quietly and sat beside him, they didn't need to speak much. The look they exchanged said enough. They were part of this now. They had stumbled into a history the neighborhood wanted to forget, but forgetting felt impossible after seeing the truth with their own eyes. Whatever came next, research, recognition, resistance from neighbors, they would face it. Because if the earth had chosen this moment to speak, someone needed to listen. The days that followed settled over the neighborhood like a heavy, humid blanket, but the quiet was no longer the comforting kind. It was a waiting quiet, a collective breath drawn and held, as news spread beyond their streets and into the city, then the state. Marcus and Leia felt it every time they opened the door or walked to the mailbox. The invisible eyes, the unspoken calculations of neighbors deciding whether to greet them, to ask questions, or to turn away. Their discovery had become the thread that unraveled the neighborhood's illusion of untouched peace. No one said it aloud, but they could feel it in the glances from porches and driveways. Some were grateful. Some were afraid. Some were angry. Official word from the county came first. A brief statement appeared in the local paper and was shared on news sites. The remains were confirmed to belong to an adult male, most likely of African descent, buried in the mid-19th century. Evidence of iron shackles was found with the body. The cause of death was impossible to determine after so many years, but injuries to the ribs and skull suggested violence. The land, once farmland, had likely belonged to a plantation owner whose records had vanished after the Civil War. The article was clinical, almost cold in its precision, but the implications burned hotter than any headline could hold. The reaction split almost instantly. Some neighbors posted messages of sorrow and solidarity online, saying the past should be faced, that the man deserved to be remembered. Others bristled, posting that it was unfair to paint the current community with sins it hadn't committed. A few expressed fear that property values would fall, that their quiet refuge would now be marked on maps of historic violence. At night, Marcus and Leah would scroll through the comments and feel both hope and despair. Hope because some voices called for truth. Despair because so many others wanted to push it back underground. Journalists began to circle more persistently. Satellite vans parked at the entrance to the subdivision. News anchors stood under umbrellas, speaking earnestly to cameras about the haunting reminder of America's unfinished history. Sometimes they knocked on doors. Marcus and Leah kept their curtains closed, but one evening a young reporter caught them as they stepped out to walk. She was polite, almost apologetic, but eager to give the man under the tree a story. Leah hesitated. Marcus felt the pull of silence, but also the weight of what he had decided days ago. Silence was complicity. They agreed to speak on their own terms. The interview was quiet, filmed in the soft evening light on their porch. Marcus spoke slowly, describing the moment of discovery not as a curiosity, but as a reckoning. He said they hadn't asked to find anything, but once they had, it felt wrong to look away. He spoke of ancestors lost to history, of the danger in pretending the past doesn't matter. Leah added that they weren't interested in blame. They wanted acknowledgement, dignity for someone who had been denied both in life and in death. The reporter listened with real care. When the piece aired the next night, it was brief but powerful. A still of Marcus and Leah standing together played beside footage of the fallen tree and the quiet street where the story had begun. The backlash came almost immediately. Some neighbors praised them, bringing casseroles or quiet thank yous whispered on evening walks, but others bristled more openly now. At the mailbox, Marcus overheard a man complain that they had dragged the whole block into the past. A flyer advertising a community petition to keep the neighborhood's image clean appeared briefly on social media before being deleted after heated argument. The split was no longer subtle. It was a fault line running directly through the community. Yet beyond the discomfort, something else stirred. A determination from those who believed the story should not be buried again. A small group formed, led by a retired teacher and a local pastor, to advocate for a proper memorial. They invited Marcus and Leah to join. At first the couple hesitated, weary from scrutiny and the strain of being unwilling torchbearers. But one night, as they sat together in their living room with the window cracked to the warm summer air, Marcus remembered Clarence's quiet story about the wagon in the dark and the neighbors who chose not to see. He turned to Leah and said softly that if they didn't stand with the truth now, they would become those neighbors too. Leah nodded, tears bright but unshed. They agreed to help. The group met several times over the next weeks, sometimes in the church hall, sometimes on someone's porch. They discussed what honoring the man could mean. A plaque near where the tree had stood, an educational marker about the history of the land, perhaps a small ceremony. Historians joined, bringing fragments of records-old land deeds, census notes that listed unnamed male, age approx 20, under property inventories. No one could prove the identity of the man, but the story sharpened. He had likely been enslaved, perhaps tried to escape, perhaps was killed and buried in secrecy. The absence of his name was its own indictment. Opposition remained, though quieter when confronted directly. A few homeowners sent polite but firm emails, arguing that such a marker would stigmatize the area. Others complained at meetings about taxes or politics. But the weight of evidence and the simple humanity of the cause began to sway more hearts than it hardened. Marcus and Leah found unexpected allies. A neighbor who admitted his own ancestors had profited from slavery, but insisted the truth mattered. A young mother who said her children deserved to know the land's real story. Slowly, the tide shifted. One humid evening, after a particularly long meeting, the Homeowners Association president, once staunchly against the idea, announced that the board would support a memorial and work with the county to host a reburial ceremony. It was not unanimous, but it was enough. Relief rippled quietly through the room. Marcus felt it like a deep exhale he hadn't realized he was holding. Leah squeezed his hand under the table. They were exhausted, but proud. The day of the ceremony arrived weeks later, under a sky as clear and blue as if the storm had never been. The massive fallen tree had long since been cut and hauled away, its roots filled and the yard leveled, though the owners had chosen not to replant. In its place stood a simple stone marker, smooth and unadorned but dignified, with an inscription chosen by the community. Unknown but remembered, may truth take root where silence once grew. Around it gathered neighbors, county officials, historians, and a few quiet onlookers from farther afield who had heard the story. Marcus and Leah stood together near the back at first, not seeking attention but unable to avoid it either. The family who owned the house stood close to the marker, subdued but present, their children clinging nervously to their parents' hands. Clarence was there, dressed neatly despite the heat, his eyes fixed on the stone, with a solemnity that spoke of decades of memory finally released. Mrs. Albright wept quietly beside her grown daughter. Reporters lingered at the edges, but kept their distance, respectful in a way they hadn't been at first. The ceremony itself was simple. A local pastor spoke of dignity and remembrance. A historian from the university offered a few gentle words about the importance of uncovering hard truths and how storms sometimes give back voices we thought were lost. The retired teacher who had first called for a memorial read a brief poem she had written, a promise that the ground would no longer hold its silence alone. Then the county official stepped forward and lowered a small wooden box containing the carefully preserved remains back into the earth, not hidden this time, but claimed with care and respect. When the moment came for the crowd to be still, a hush fell so deep it felt sacred. The breeze rustled through leaves newly grown where the great tree had once stood. Marcus found himself holding Leah's hand tightly. He thought of the morning when they had found the skull, of the cold, damp mud on his fingers, of the fear and uncertainty that had followed. Now that fear had transformed into something steadier, a quiet conviction that the man was no longer alone. After the final words, people lingered. Some placed small stones or flowers at the base of the marker. Others simply stood, heads bowed. Conversations began softly, apologies across time, commitments to teach children honestly, neighbors introducing themselves in a way they hadn't before. Marcus and Leah received a few embraces, a few quiet thanks. One man who had once muttered about property values approached Marcus awkwardly and said, "You did the right thing." Marcus nodded, accepting without triumph, only relief. As the crowd thinned and the sun dipped lower, turning the sky gold, Marcus and Leah remained. They watched the last of the officials pack up equipment, the reporters drifting away. Clarence passed by and tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement that some old burden had finally been shared. The yard, once a wound, now held a solemn beauty, a place marked not by fear, but by memory. Walking home hand in hand, Marcus and Leah felt lighter, though not untouched. The past hadn't vanished. Its weight would always be there. But it had been spoken, faced, given form. The silence had cracked open, and through it something human and enduring had emerged. Their street, once merely a backdrop to their dream of safety, had become a living witness to history. That night, as they sat on their porch, listening to crickets and the faint hum of a repaired power line, Leah rested her head on Marcus's shoulder. They watched the faint glow of the memorial marker down the block, a quiet sentinel where a tree had once stood. It wasn't victory in any grand sense. It was something humbler, but no less profound. A truth acknowledged, a man no longer forgotten, a community changed, however slowly, however imperfectly. Marcus thought of the man beneath the roots, of the storm that had ripped open the earth and forced this reckoning. He imagined that man walking once, breathing once, dreaming once, never knowing that someday strangers would fight to give him a name he never had. The thought steadied him. He didn't need to know why fate had chosen their morning run to reveal the past. It was enough to know they had not turned away. Leah, eyes half closed against the warm night, whispered that she was glad they had stopped running that morning, glad they had looked closer. Marcus squeezed her hand. Neither spoke again. The cicadas sang. The night held stillness, but it was no longer the silence of denial. It was the calm that comes after hard truth, fragile yet honest, alive with the quiet dignity of remembrance. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some truths are too important to keep to yourself.